Hello, my name is Eliza Bustos, and this is the video presentation for the special project for Management 6345 at West Texas AMU in the fall of 2019. I chose to complete my special project on the film Darkest Hour. It's a 2017 film set in Great Britain in May of 1940 and chronicles many of the historical events leading up to World War II, most notably the election to the seat of Prime Minister of Winston Churchill and the following crises and the following events of his leadership during that first month of his time as Prime Minister. So the film opens with a really raucous scene in Parliament as they're debating who should be the next Prime Minister. This is really our first introduction to the aftermath of poor leadership as Neville Chamberlain, the former sitting Prime Minister, is being ousted due to lack of leadership, what one might call laissez-faire leadership, as he was too passive in the face of this extreme danger with the approaching Nazi regime. So Neville Chamberlain, Viscount Halifax, and the King are all quite opposed to the election of Winston Churchill. He has a poor track record militaristically, but also interpersonally, as he tends to be very emotionally labile, very bombastic, does not consider the needs of followers well at all. So much of this first part of the film is focused on who should be elected prime minister and how could it be anybody other than Winston Churchill. However, he does end up being elected. So he has this element of assigned leadership in that he is not well liked by many people at all. So he lacks initially that referent power, and the rest of the film really chronicles his transformation into a very different type of leader as he learns to interact with people on a much more human level. He was elected prime minister largely because he had an extraordinary gift for military strategy as well as for very rousing speeches. He was known to be very dedicated, and he happened to be kind of a middle of the road person that a lot of people could somewhat get behind, though not many of them could enthusiastically get behind him. So in this early part of the film, we really see that he exhibits an authority compliant style of leadership in that he's very hard driving, he's relentless, he does not consider others' emotions, he seems to be very unstable. And we get to watch that transformation throughout the film. So one of these first interactions where we observe that authority compliance, very directive style of leadership is when he's interacting with his new typist who happens to make a mistake and he just explodes. So this is a perfect example of him not considering somebody else's feelings, not treating them like a human, but really he's very task oriented, very behavior oriented, and it's this element of his personality that tends to drive people away from him. So in this instance, his wife, Clementine, also a very adept situational leader in her own right, comes to him and really is able to employ a lot of the elements of situational leadership and leader-member exchange in that she identifies his emotional needs and is able to appeal to him, saying to him that this modification of his behaviors would help to endear him to his followers, which is really something that he would like, though something he's not particularly good at. He, again, is very directive, very task-oriented, very pragmatic. So this is one of our first scenes where we get to see him begin to transform, and it's at this behest of Clementine, who also is a great leader in her own respect. One of the following scenes is regarding his family's reaction to his election to the seat of Prime Minister. It's a very cool reaction on the part of his children in particular. And I think this is one of our first ways of observing his incredible self-sacrifice and his incredible commitment to the country and to his rise to power. So that is another thing that we really value in leaders, but it's interesting because it can also go the opposite direction. And from the perspective of his family, it clearly had gone the opposite direction as they were not thrilled with his election and had probably missed out on him being around for a lot of their lives. So we next open on a scene between him and King George VI, who, like we've mentioned earlier, was pretty disdainful of him as Churchill was towards him. They had this really awkward relationship. There was quite a bit of distrust and a good undercurrent of disdain in their initial dealings with one another. So as the film progresses on, we get to watch that relationship morph. They were very much going from being in one another's out groups to the in group, and the process of that transition from out group to in group occurred again through incredible self-sacrifice, Churchill's devotion to his job, his devotion to his country, and the king observing this, that observation on the king's part led to a softening, which leads to this reciprocal softening on Churchill's part. So we really get to watch their relationship move from being exclusively out-group members to very in-group members who share a mature partnership, really with emotional reciprocity, relying on one another in these very dark times. So following that relationship forming with the king, we see the big conflict of the rescue of the soldiers at Dunkirk. And this is another example of Churchill utilizing that very directive, that very hard driving style of leadership, where he was all task oriented, all strategy oriented, because he was driven by this incredible need to rescue the men at Dunkirk. So while his interactions with other leaders involved in this scenario are pretty terse, he does end up achieving his goal. And because he achieves that goal, he's further endeared to these followers, including the people with whom he had some terse interactions. It became pretty clear that the means really got him to that desired end, which was the saving of thousands of lives. So in this situation, though it was not relational or participative, it ended up being very effective because it was what the situation called for. Churchill is often seen with that really situational approach. He's very fluid and adept, exhibits excellent leader cognition, expert leadership, because he knows, as the movie progresses, we see that he knows when to modify that style. In this instance at Dunkirk, because it was so fraught with imminent danger and lives immediately at risk, that really directive, driving style was exactly what needed to happen at the time. Where we really begin to see a shift from that directive approach to a participative and a very relational approach is as Winston Churchill and the king are having a conversation where we really see the cementing of their relationship. And the king uses their newfound emotional reciprocity to give him some advice, in which he says to Winston that he needs to go to the people and he needs to understand what they want and what they would do, because as a leader, he represents the will of the group. So it was remarked upon earlier in the film that Churchill had never ridden the Underground. He is from a much higher class and had never had to do so. So we see him boarding the Underground and looking quite awkward initially. And it's a very poignant scene as he talks to all different members of his followers and their various groups. So you see workmen, you see young children, you see women with children, as he begins to talk to them and try to find out their stories. And you see this incredible shift from this hard S1 directing leader into someone who's very concerned about the emotions, the wants, the needs, the fulfillment of his followers. He wants to know their opinions. He wants to know their capabilities. So we really see him endear himself to his followers in this respect. So the outcome of that experience is, as he asks their opinion, his will and his resolve becomes very crystallized as he observes these follower characteristics of self-efficacy, self-confidence. They have very strong internal loci of control. He realizes what his best course of action is based on the feelings of his followers. So again, we've moved from this very solo directive approach to being a much more participative. We're seeing him begin to shift to that transformational style of leadership as he interacts with his people. So that occurs on the Underground train. He also goes to visit the outer cabinet, which has been largely left out of decision-making processes, and he observes exactly the same thing, that they are ready to fight. Now, this is very contrary to his experiences within the War Cabinet, where there has been dissension among the members of his War Cabinet. He chose to include Neville Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister, and Viscount Halifax, who's from the opposing political party, who also wished to be Prime Minister, within that War Cabinet group. So we see a lot of conflict between them as their leadership styles clash, as their opinions clash. And that is in particular where we see Churchill be very bombastic and very aggressive. So had he not gone to the people on the Underground and the people in the outer cabinet, he had very different voices in his ear. So again, this really cements that relationship of trust and reciprocity between he and the king, as this has turned out to be the very best thing he could have done. He was also at the nadir of his feelings at that time, and seeing the people and their resolve really helped bolster him to go and deliver his final speech, the one where he says, "We will fight on the beaches." It's one of the most memorable speeches in history. And it's where we really see him take on that role as a transformational leader, where he becomes very concerned with not his own political power or his own agenda, but the self-actualization, the safety, the goals of his people. And we also see him exhibit many traits of an outstanding leader. In fact, we see him move through all three forms of outstanding leadership, in that his charisma comes out with his incredible speeches and his command of language and oration. He's a very pragmatic leader in that he's very directive and problem solving, wants to focus very much at the task at hand. But the root of his leadership style is probably in his ideology. He has an unwavering, unshakable belief against fascism and against Hitler and the Nazi regime. In no way does he believe, now that he's seen the resolve of his people, that they should succumb and not fight. So we've really watched over the course of the film this very bombastic, aggressive leader transform into somebody who has been able to crystallize the people underneath him and behind him to fight this imposing tide. And I think there are many factors that go into that, not the least of which is the surrounding situation and who his followers are. Their internal locus of control and their self-efficacy really allows him to become that participative leader rather than having to be so directive. But it was also this directive approach that allowed him to gain trust with his followers in this dire time. Everyone was looking to him for safety and security, and he provided it. And once he had provided that, it empowered his followers and actualized his followers to persist in that fight. It was a wonderful film that really shows Churchill as the embodiment of one of the greatest leaders of all time.